She had learned to read a letter before she opened it. Not the words, the paper itself. The weight of it sitting in her palm, the thickness of the wax seal, whether the ink had pressed through to the back. Because when Duke Cornelius wrote in haste, when he was exhausted or afraid or writing by the thin light of a campfire with the sound of cannon somewhere beyond the tree line, the ink always bled through. Always. She had noticed it the third letter he ever sent her, back when the war was still something happening at a distance, something that belonged to maps and dispatches and men in uniform rooms. She had pressed her finger to the back of that third letter and felt the grooves his pen had made, and she had understood, without anyone telling her, that the pressure of a man's hand when he writes tells you everything his words are trying to hide. This letter was no different. She stood in her dressing room on a cold February morning in 1804, still in her corset, her hair half-pinned, the maid waiting silently in the corner with a brush she had stopped lifting 10 minutes ago. The fire was going. The room smelled of orange blossom water and beeswax, and, faintly, the coal dust that crept under every door in this city no matter how many times you told the staff to seal the gaps. Duchess Harriet Ashworth stood very still. She turned the letter over once. She pressed 2 fingers flat against the back of it. The ink had bled. She sat down on the edge of the bed, not gracefully, the way you sit when your legs decide before your mind does. The silk of her underdress caught beneath her, and she did not fix it. She just sat there, in the half-dressed quiet of a room that smelled of everything domestic and safe, holding a letter from a man who was neither of those things anymore. Who had not been either of those things for 14 months. 14 months since Duke Cornelius Ashworth had ridden out of the gates of their estate with 40,000 men at his back and a war at his front, and had turned, once, only once, to look at her where she stood on the steps. He had not waved, neither had she. They had never been the sort of people who waved at each other. They were the sort of people who understood things without saying them, which sounds like a gift and is, in fact, absolutely exhausting. She had gone inside. She had sat at her desk. She had written 6 letters before noon, to his political allies, to the supply commissioner, to the minister of war, all of them signed in his name, because that was what they had agreed. That was the arrangement. That was her war. Nobody would ever know. Nobody ever does. This is Prince Pedro's Love Bait, where we give the forgotten ones their moment. If Harriet's story already has you feeling something, hit subscribe and bring someone with you. These stories deserve an audience. She did not open it straight away. That was the thing nobody understood about Harriet Ashworth. Everyone assumed a wife waited desperately for letters from the front, that she sat by the window watching the road, that the moment a messenger appeared at the gate, she ran. They imagined her tearful and grateful, pressing the paper to her chest like something from a painting. The reality was considerably less romantic. The reality was that Harriet had learned, over 14 months of this war, that opening a letter too quickly was dangerous. Not because of what it might say, because of what it would do to her face. And her face, in February of 1804, belonged to the empire as much as it belonged to her. She could not afford to read devastating news and then walk into a room full of courtiers with red eyes and a trembling chin. She was Duchess Harriet Ashworth, wife of the commanding general of the Allied Northern Forces. Every expression she wore in public was a political statement, whether she intended it that way or not. So she waited. She set the letter on her writing desk, face down, and she finished dressing. She let the maid pin her hair. She drank half a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm and ate 3 bites of bread she did not taste. She looked out the window at the courtyard below, where 2 of the junior staff were carrying firewood across the frost-hardened ground, their breath coming out in short white clouds, and she watched them the way you watch things when your mind is entirely elsewhere. Then she sat down at the desk, and she picked up the letter, and she opened it. Cornelius wrote the way he commanded, efficiently. No wasted words, no sentiment for its own sake. His letters read like military dispatches, with the occasional human moment inserted almost reluctantly, as though he had been reminded at the last moment that he was writing to his wife and not to the War Office. The position at Varenne holds. Losses were manageable. The men are in reasonable spirit, given the conditions. Manageable. That word. She had circled it in his last 3 letters with her finger, not with ink, just pressing the pad of her thumb against it. Manageable could mean 40 men. It could mean 400. It could mean he was lying to protect her, or lying to protect himself from having to account for it on the page. She never knew which. That was the part that kept her awake at 3 in the morning, when the house was silent and the fire had gone to ash, and she was lying in a bed that was too large and too cold and too quiet. She read on. Supply lines remain the primary concern. I have written to Pemberton about the northern route. If he does not act within the fortnight, I will need you to apply pressure from your end. You know how to handle Pemberton better than I do. You always have. That was the closest Cornelius ever came to a compliment. You know how to handle it better than I do. 14 months of war, and that was the language of their partnership. Functional, precise, built on the understanding that she was not merely waiting at home, but actively managing the political machinery that kept his campaign alive. Lord Pemberton was the Minister of Logistics. He was also lazy, vain, and extraordinarily susceptible to flattery delivered by the right person in the right setting. Harriet had known this for 3 years. She had already written to him twice this month. She would write again tomorrow. She would frame it as his idea, because men like Pemberton only moved when they believed the movement originated with them. It was exhausting. She did it anyway. She kept reading. The letter was 4 pages. She read it 3 times, as she always did. The first time for the content. The second time for the gaps. The things he had started to write and stopped. The places where the pen had hesitated and the ink had pooled slightly before moving on. The third time she read it for tone, because tone told her more than content ever did. Whether he was frightened, whether he was sleeping, whether the war was going the way the official dispatches claimed, or whether those dispatches were, as she increasingly suspected, a polished version of something considerably messier. The tone of this letter was controlled, too controlled. Cornelius wrote loosest when things were going well. When the campaign had momentum, his sentences ran longer, his observations became almost wry, and once, only once, in a letter from the autumn, he had written a single line about the way the light fell across the valley at dusk that had made Harriet put the paper down and press her hand flat against her sternum and stand very still for almost a full minute. This letter had none of that. This letter was a man keeping himself in check, measuring every word before it went down, which meant something was wrong, and he had decided not to tell her what. She folded it. She placed it in the left drawer of the desk, beneath the false bottom she had installed 18 months ago without telling anyone, where she kept every letter he had ever sent her in chronological order, tied with a piece of undyed ribbon that had once been the sash of a dress she no longer wore. She locked the drawer. She stood up. She walked to the mirror above the fireplace, and she looked at her own face for a long moment. Checked it the way you check a room before guests arrive. Everything in its place, nothing left out that shouldn't be seen. Satisfied, she turned away. She had a court dinner in 4 hours. Lord Reginald Colley would be there. She had been watching Colley for 6 weeks, quietly, carefully. The way you watch something you are not yet sure is dangerous, because the moment you act too soon, you lose the advantage of knowing more than he thinks you know. Tonight she would watch him again, and she would smile. And she would say the right things to the right people. And she would come home and sit in the dark and think. That was her war. Nobody was writing dispatches about it. Nobody ever would. She had been watching Colley for 6 weeks. Not obviously, never obviously. That was the first rule of watching someone you suspected but could not yet prove. You gave them nothing. No narrowed eyes across a dinner table, no pointed questions, no coldness in your greeting that might tell them you were looking. You smiled. You included them. You made them feel so thoroughly unwatched that they grew comfortable. and comfortable men made mistakes. Lord Reginald Colley had been making small ones for months. Nothing she could take to anyone. Nothing that would survive the scrutiny of a formal accusation. Just small things. The way he asked certain questions about Cornelius's supply routes with an interest that was slightly too specific for a man whose official remit was domestic policy. The way he had known, 3 weeks before the official dispatch arrived, that the Allied forces had taken the bridge at Morennes. He had mentioned it in passing at Lady Fenwick's card evening, dropped it into a sentence about something else entirely, and then moved on so quickly that Harriet suspected he hadn't realized he'd said it at all. She had not moved, had not looked up from her cards. She had simply filed it. The way she filed everything, not on paper, not anywhere that could be found, but in the part of her mind she had set aside specifically for things that did not yet have a name, but would, eventually, if she was patient enough. That had been 5 weeks ago. Tonight, she was going to be patient a little longer. The court dinner was held at the Hartley residence, which meant 3 floors of overheated rooms, 200 people in formal dress, and Lord Hartley himself moving through the crowd with the particular energy of a man who believed hosting a dinner was the same thing as having something interesting to say. Harriet arrived at precisely the right time, not early enough to seem eager, not late enough to seem difficult. She had learned this calibration years ago. Timing at court was its own language. She wore deep green silk, high neckline, her mother's pearl earrings. She had chosen the green deliberately. It was the color she wore when she needed to be noticed without appearing to try, when she needed people to come to her. Colley found her within 20 minutes. They always did, the ones with something to hide. They sought her out because she was the Duke's wife, and proximity to her was proximity to power. And men who dealt in information were always drawn to power, even when it frightened them. Especially when it frightened them. Duchess Ashworth, he bowed. He had a pleasant face, Colley. That was the thing that made him dangerous. A pleasant, forgettable face, and small, extraordinarily alert eyes. Lord Colley, she smiled, warm, unhurried. I have been meaning to ask, how is your sister? She was unwell last month, I understand. She had not been meaning to ask. She did not particularly care about his sister, but the question did 2 things simultaneously. It established that she kept track of details about him, which was flattering, and it moved the conversation immediately onto ground she controlled. He relaxed, slightly, visibly if you knew where to look. They talked for 12 minutes. She asked about his position on the Northern Trade Committee. She let him explain something she already knew in full, because men who are explaining things are not asking them, and she needed him talking, not questioning. She watched his hands. People who were concealing things touched their faces more than they realized. Colley touched the side of his jaw twice. At minute 11, she said, very lightly, Cornelius mentions in his latest correspondence that the Varennes supply line is holding better than expected. Such a relief after last quarter. It was not in the letter. She had invented it entirely. Colley's eyes moved, just slightly. Just for a fraction of a second, the pleasant face recalibrated. Not with surprise exactly, but with the specific micro-expression of someone cross-referencing what they have just heard against information they already hold. He knew about Varennes. He knew something about Varennes that she had not told him, that no official dispatch had yet confirmed, and the mention of it had made him check himself against it. She felt the knowledge settle into her chest like a stone dropping into still water, cold, heavy, certain. She smiled at something he said and moved on to speak with Lady Constance, and she did not look back at Colley, and she did not let her hands shake, and she did not think about what it meant that a man with access to the court's inner circle had prior intelligence about her husband's most vulnerable supply position. She did not think about any of that until she was home. The house was quiet when she returned, past 11. The staff had left a single lamp burning in the entrance hall and banked the fire in her sitting room. She sent the remaining maid to bed. She sat down in the chair nearest the fire, still in her green silk, still wearing her mother's pearls, and she allowed herself, for the first time all evening, to feel frightened. Not for long. Harriet Ashworth had made a rule early in this war. Fear was permitted, but only in private and only briefly. You felt it, you measured it, and then you decided what to do with it. She sat there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she stood up. She went to her desk. She took out a clean sheet of paper, dipped her pen, and began to write. Not to Cornelius, not yet, because a letter to the front took 3 weeks, and she did not have 3 weeks. But a list. Names. Dates. The bridge at Morennes. The supply line at Varennes. The 2 small touches to the side of Colley's jaw. Evidence was not yet what this was, but it was the beginning of evidence, and beginnings, in Harriet's experience, were everything. The invitation to Lady Pembridge's dinner had arrived 4 days ago, and Harriet had accepted it the same afternoon, which was unusual for her. She normally waited 2 days before responding to anything. Waiting was information. It told people something about how much you needed them, and Harriet was very careful about what she let people know she needed. But Lady Pembridge's dinner was different.
Lord Colley would be there. She had confirmed it through Lady Constance, who had confirmed it through Lady Pembridge's secretary, who had no idea he was being used as an intelligence source and would have been appalled to know it. Harriet needed to be in that room. She needed to watch Colley in a different setting, around different people, to see whether what she had observed at the Hartley dinner was a pattern or an accident. In her experience, it was never an accident. She dressed carefully. Not the green this time. The green had done its work, and repeating a strategy too soon was the same as having no strategy at all. Tonight, she wore dark blue, the shade that sat somewhere between formal and severe, the shade that said, "I am not here to charm you. I am here because I belong here," which was its own kind of power when deployed correctly. She wore no jewelry except her wedding ring.
She had learned that going without jewelry at court made people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't quite explain, and uncomfortable people talked more than they meant to. The dinner was held in the Pembridge townhouse on the north side of the square, a tall, narrow building crammed with furniture that had been fashionable 15 years ago, and staff who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing this long enough to be invisible. Harriet arrived, greeted her hostess, accepted a glass of wine she would not drink, and moved into the room. 26 guests. She counted without appearing to. Colley was near the fireplace, speaking with Sir Edmund Graves, who was on the Parliamentary Committee for Military Supply. That combination, Colley, Graves, a fireplace conversation before dinner, tightened something in Harriet's chest that she immediately loosened, because tightness in the chest showed on the face, and the face was not hers tonight. She worked the room for 40 minutes before dinner was called. She spoke with 7 people. She asked 4 of them questions she already knew the answers to, because the point was not the answer, but the watching. Who shifted when certain subjects came up? Who looked at whom when she mentioned the Northern Campaign? Who laughed a fraction too loudly at something that was not quite funny enough to warrant it? She was building a picture. She had been building it for weeks. Every conversation was another brushstroke. Dinner itself was 12 courses and 2 hours, and the kind of collective performance that Harriet had been participating in since she was 17 years old, and her mother had first brought her to court, with instructions to say little, observe everything, and never let anyone see her counting the room. She had been counting rooms ever since. She was seated 4 places from Colley, which was close enough. She did not look at him directly during the first 6 courses. She let him forget she was paying attention. She talked to the man on her left about his estate in the north, and the man on her right about his daughter's recent marriage. And she was warm and interested and entirely present with both of them, while the part of her mind she kept separate and cool was fixed, without moving, on Colley. He spoke to Graves twice during dinner, low, brief. The second time, he said something that made Graves set his fork down for a moment, before picking it up again and continuing to eat, which was the kind of almost nothing that most people would not notice, and that Harriet noticed the way you notice a sound in a quiet house at night, immediately and completely. After dinner, the party divided, as it always did, into smaller rooms. Cards in the east drawing room, conversation in the west, a small number of people clustered in the hall who had not quite decided which they preferred. Harriet chose the west room. So did Colley, 3 minutes later. She was already in conversation with Lady Constance when he arrived. She did not acknowledge him. She laughed at something Constance said, genuinely, because Constance was actually funny, which was the rarest quality at court. And then she let the conversation open naturally to include the people nearest them, which included, within 5 minutes, Colley himself. He was careful tonight, more careful than at Hartley, which told her the Varenne comment had registered with him after all, that somewhere between that dinner and this one, he had replayed it and felt the edge of it and decided to be more measured. Good. Measured men were easier to read than relaxed ones. Relaxed men talked. Measured men made choices, and choices left marks. She asked him one question all evening, just one, about the parliamentary schedule for the following month. Dry, administrative, the kind of question a duchess might ask out of vague political interest and nothing more. He answered it fully. He was almost expansive about it. He held her gaze for slightly too long at the end of his answer, the way people do when they are trying to appear completely untroubled. She thanked him. She moved on. In the carriage home, she sat in the dark, and she thought about Sir Edmund Graves setting his fork down. She thought about Colley's eyes at Hartley, crossing-referencing. She thought about the parliamentary schedule and what she now knew about it that she had not known this morning. It was not enough yet, but it was close. She could feel the shape of it now, the way you feel the edge of something in the dark before you can see what it is. And tomorrow she would write to a man she had never written to before, who owed Cornelius a debt that had never been called in. Tomorrow she would begin to pull the thread. The man she needed to write to was called Arthur Hexam. He was not a lord, not a minister, not anyone whose name appeared in the court circular or the parliamentary record, or any of the official documents that shaped the public face of power. He was, on paper, a private land surveyor with an office on the eastern side of the city, and a reputation for discretion that had been earned over 30 years of knowing things about powerful people and declining to use that knowledge unless circumstances made it absolutely necessary. Cornelius had used him once, 7 years ago, in a matter Harriet knew only in outline. She had never asked for the details. She had simply observed the outcome. A particular political problem had been quietly resolved. A particular man had withdrawn from a particular position without explanation, and Cornelius had come home one evening looking like a man who had set down something very heavy, and she had understood that Hexam was the kind of resource you kept in reserve. The kind you did not spend until you had no other currency left. She was not yet at that point, but she was close enough to start the conversation. She wrote to him on a Wednesday morning, between her correspondence to the supply commissioner and a letter she owed to Cornelius's mother, who wrote every fortnight with the particular blend of warmth and anxiety that characterized women who loved soldiers and had run out of useful things to do about it. Harriet wrote to the older woman with genuine care. She liked her mother-in-law more than she liked most people, and then she set that letter aside and sat for a moment looking at the blank page in front of her. Writing to Hexam required precision. She could not say too much. If the letter were intercepted, and she had to operate on the assumption that any letter could be intercepted because that assumption had saved her from carelessness more than once, it had to read as nothing more than a professional inquiry. She needed to say enough that he would understand what she was actually asking without her having said it plainly. She wrote for 20 minutes. She crossed out 4 sentences. The final letter was 8 lines long and mentioned, in its apparently mundane body, 3 specific details: a date,
a name, and a location, that together formed a question only Hexam would know how to answer. She sealed it herself. She gave it to Thomas Birch to deliver by hand, not by the regular post. Thomas was the only member of the household staff she trusted with anything that mattered.
He was 24 years old, the son of a man who had served Cornelius's father, and he possessed the extremely rare quality of being genuinely uninterested in other people's business. He delivered things and told no one and asked no questions. Not out of discipline, but out of a fundamental incuriosity about the world that Harriet had recognized and valued from the first week of his employment. She watched him go from the upstairs window. Then she went back to her desk and got on with the rest of the morning, because there was always a rest of the morning, and it always needed getting on with. There were 3 more letters to write before noon. A meeting with the house steward about the quarterly accounts, which she handled herself since Cornelius had left because the alternative was trusting them to someone else, and she had learned early that trusting financial details to someone else was the fastest way to find yourself in a difficulty you had not seen coming. An hour in the afternoon set aside for Lady Constance, who was coming for tea, and who would bring, alongside the genuine warmth of her company, the careful social intelligence she gathered the way other women gathered flowers, naturally, constantly, without appearing to try. Constance arrived at 3. She sat in the chair by the fire with her teacup balanced on her knee, and she talked for 20 minutes about nothing of consequence. A christening, a disagreement about a property boundary between 2 families who deserved each other, a piece of music she had heard at a recital and could not get out of her head. Harriet listened. She always listened to the nothing before the something, because Constance always had a something, and rushing toward it produced worse results than letting it arrive on its own. It arrived with the second cup of tea. "I heard something last night," Constance said. She said it lightly, the way she said things she did not feel lightly at all. "From Margaret Graves. You know she talks when she's had wine." "I know," Harriet said. "She said Sir Edmund, has been making enquiries about the Veldrin contracts, the military supply contracts for the Eastern campaign." She set her teacup down. "She said he was doing it quietly, through a third party, not through his committee." Harriet kept her face entirely still. The Veldrin contracts were Cornelius's supply framework for the next 8 months of the campaign. If someone was making quiet inquiries about them outside of official channels, outside of the parliamentary committee that existed specifically to oversee them, then either those contracts were about to become a liability, or someone was preparing to make them one. Cawley. Graves. The fork set down at dinner. The shape of it was clearer now. Not fully visible, but close enough that she could feel the edges of it, and they were sharper than she had hoped. She thanked Constance. They talked for another hour about nothing of consequence. After she left, Harriet sat at her desk and added 2 lines to the list she had started the night of the Hartley dinner. She looked at the full list for a long moment, then she locked it away. Hexam would reply within the week. Until then, she would watch and wait and smile at every dinner she was invited to and give nothing away. That was the only kind of patience that had ever kept her safe. The first week without a letter she managed perfectly well. That was not unusual. The post from the front was unreliable at the best of times, delayed by weather, by troop movements, by the simple logistical chaos of moving correspondence across several hundred miles of contested territory. Cornelius had warned her about this before he left. He had sat across from her at the desk in his study the evening before he rode out, and explained the postal situation with the same calm precision he used to explain everything, and she had listened and nodded, and understood that there would be gaps, and that the gaps did not necessarily mean anything. She had understood that intellectually. The second week was harder. She kept her routine. That was the only thing she knew to do with fear. Keep moving. Keep the structure intact, because the moment you let the structure soften, the fear found the gaps and filled them. So she rose at the same time each morning,
She wrote her letters. She managed the accounts. She attended the 2 social engagements on her calendar and wore the right things to both of them and said the right things to the right people, and came home and sat at her desk and looked at the drawer where his letters lived and did not open it. Because opening it would mean reading them again, and reading them again would mean admitting to herself why she needed to. Hexam had replied on the 6th day, brief, coded in the same way her letter had been coded. What he told her, what she understood him to be telling her, reading between the careful lines of it, confirmed that the Veldrin contracts had been accessed. Not officially, not through any channel that would leave a clean record, but accessed, nonetheless, by someone with enough proximity to the right people to make the access look routine. She had sat with that information for 3 days now, turning it over, examining it from different angles the way you examine something fragile that you cannot afford to drop. It pointed to Colley. Everything pointed to Colley, but pointing was not the same as proving, and she had learned a long time ago that moving on a man like Colley without proof was not justice. It was an accusation. And an accusation without proof, against a man with his connections and his pleasant, forgettable face, would not damage him. It would damage her. She needed one more thing, one clean, unambiguous piece. She did not yet have it. On the 14th day without a letter, she woke at 4 in the morning and lay in the dark and did something she had not permitted herself to do in months. She thought about the worst possibility. She let herself think it clearly and completely, without flinching away from it, because she had discovered early in this war that the thoughts you refuse to think had a way of growing larger in the refusal. Better to look at them directly, better to know exactly what you were afraid of. She was afraid that the silence meant he was dead. She lay there and she thought that thought, and she felt the full weight of it, what it would mean, what the world would look like on the other side of it, what she would do and who she would be and how she would manage the morning after receiving that news and every morning after that. She thought about it until it had a shape and a size and was no longer an undefined dread, but a specific, finite, terrible thing. Then she decided it had not happened. Not because she had any evidence that it hadn't, simply because she could not afford for it to be true yet. There was too much still undone. Colley was still in position. The Veldrin contracts were still compromised. The supply lines were still Cornelius's supply lines, and someone was still feeding information about them to people who wanted him to fail. And if she fell apart now, if she let the silence win, then everything she had been quietly building for 6 weeks fell apart with her. She was not going to let that happen. She got up. It was still dark. She put on her dressing gown and went downstairs to the small sitting room and built up the fire herself because it was 4 in the morning and she was not going to wake the staff for this. She made it burn well. She sat in front of it and she looked at the flames and she breathed. Lady Constance arrived uninvited at 11 o'clock, which told Harriet that word of the silence had reached her through whatever network of quiet observation she maintained. Constance said nothing about it when she came in. She sat down, she accepted tea, she talked about 3 completely inconsequential things, and then she reached across and put her hand over Harriet's where it rested on the arm of the chair. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "He is the most stubborn man in the Allied forces," Constance said eventually. "He is almost certainly fine and simply hasn't written because something is occupying him and he doesn't yet know what to say about it." "That is exactly the kind of thing people say," Harriet said, "when they don't know." "Yes," Constance said, "it is." They sat there for another hour. The fire went on burning. Outside, the February light was flat and gray and non-committal. Harriet did not cry. She had made a rule about crying, and the rule was that she was permitted to do it alone, and briefly, and never in a way that required anyone else to manage the aftermath. But she let Constance keep her hand where it was. That was enough. For today, that was enough. Tomorrow she would write to Hexam again. Tomorrow she would take the next step toward Colley, whatever that step turned out to be. But today she sat by the fire with her oldest friend's hand over hers, and she waited. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Hexam's second reply arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked inside a routine delivery of household invoices, which was exactly how she had asked him to send it.
She opened it at her desk, read it twice, folded it, and held it in both hands for a moment the way she sometimes held Cornelius's letters before she was ready to act on what they contained. This one was shorter than the first, 4 sentences. But 4 sentences from Hexam carried the weight of a full parliamentary report, because he did not write anything he had not already verified through at least 2 independent sources. That was his value, not speed, certainty. What he had verified was this: the Veldran contracts had been accessed on 3 separate occasions over the past 2 months. The access had been logged under a clerical reference number that corresponded to a junior parliamentary aide, a young man of no particular significance whose name Harriet did not recognize. But the aide reported directly to Sir Edmund Graves, and Graves, as she already knew, had been in quiet and regular conversation with Lord Reginald Cawley since October. 3 occasions, 2 months. One chain of connection that led, if you followed it carefully and without rushing, directly to a man who had touched the side of his jaw twice at a dinner party and set his fork down at another one. She had her thread. Now she needed to pull it without letting him feel the pull until it was too late to release himself from it. She thought about it for 2 days. She did not rush this part. Rushing was how careful people made careless mistakes, and she had not come this far by being careless. She went about her routine. She attended a small supper at the Ashford house, where she spent 40 minutes talking to a woman she found moderately tedious about a subject she found completely tedious, because the woman's husband sat on the same parliamentary committee as Graves, and she needed to understand the internal dynamics of that committee before she moved. She wrote to Cornelius's mother. She reviewed the household accounts. She slept when she could, which was not always. On the 3rd day, she wrote a letter to Lord Graves. Not about Cawley, not about the contracts. She wrote to him about his daughter's husband, a young army captain serving under Cornelius's command. And she wrote with the specific warmth of a woman who had received good news about someone you cared about and wanted to share it. And the good news she shared, entirely fabricated, entirely plausible, placed the young captain in a position of notable distinction in a recent engagement that reflected extremely well on his character and his judgment. She sent it by the regular post. She wanted it to arrive in the normal way, to look like exactly what it appeared to be. Graves would be pleased. He was fond of his son-in-law. He would feel, upon reading that letter, warmly disposed toward Harriet Ashworth. And a man warmly disposed toward you was a man whose guard was down. And a man whose guard was down was a man who could be spoken to directly about sensitive matters without the conversation immediately becoming defensive. She gave it 4 days to arrive and be read and do its quiet work. Then she requested a meeting. She framed it as a routine matter regarding the Northern Supply Committee, something she needed his guidance on, something related to Cornelius's campaign that required the expertise of a man with his particular experience. Graves accepted within a day. Of course he did. She was the Duke's wife, and she had just written him a generous letter about his son-in-law. They met in his parliamentary office on a gray Tuesday afternoon. She wore gray herself, understated. She brought no notes, which told him this was a conversation, not a formal proceeding. She talked to him for 20 minutes about the supply committee, asking questions that were genuine and listening to his answers with real attention, because the worst thing you could do in a conversation like this was make a man feel he was being managed before you had finished managing him. Then she paused. She looked at the window. She let a beat of silence sit between them, the kind of silence that creates an opening. Then she said, quietly and without drama, that she had become aware of certain irregularities in the access records for the Veldran contracts, that she had not taken them to anyone officially because she was not certain of their significance, and she did not want to create difficulty for people who might have entirely innocent explanations for what appeared to be unusual patterns of access.
She watched his face very carefully as she said this.
He went still in the specific way of a man who has just understood that a conversation he thought was going one way is in fact going somewhere else entirely, and that he arrived at it without enough time to prepare. She did not press him. She simply said that she imagined a man with his experience and his committee oversight would know better than she did how to interpret such records, and that she would feel considerably more comfortable if she could trust that the matter was being looked into through the appropriate channels, by the appropriate people. She left the rest of the sentence unfinished. Graves was not a stupid man. He understood the unfinished sentence completely. He understood that she knew, and that she was giving him the opportunity to resolve it without her having to escalate it, and that the cost of not resolving it was something neither of them needed to articulate out loud. He told her she could trust the matter would be handled. She thanked him warmly.
She asked after his son-in-law.
She left. In the street outside, she walked to her carriage and climbed in and sat down and looked at her hands in her lap. They were perfectly steady. She had done it. Nobody would ever know she had done it. That was the point. And somehow, sitting in that carriage on that gray Tuesday afternoon, that was also the loneliest thing she had ever felt. The letter arrived on a Friday, not from the front, from the War Office, which was different. The War Office wrote when something had been officially confirmed, when the news was too significant to pass through the ordinary postal channels, when it needed the weight of an institutional seal behind it to make it real. Harriet was at her desk when Thomas brought it in. She saw the seal before she saw anything else. Dark red wax, the official stamp, the kind of envelope that had delivered the worst news of a dozen women she knew. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. Thomas set it on the desk and left without being asked, which was one of the reasons she valued him above almost everyone in the household. She put both hands flat on the desk on either side of the envelope. She had thought, in the carriage after the meeting with Graves, that she had already experienced the loneliest thing she would ever feel. She had been wrong. This was lonelier. This was sitting in a room by herself with an envelope that was about to tell her something irrevocable, with no one to hold her hand and no performance to hide behind and nowhere to put her face while she found out. She opened it. Cornelius was alive. She read that line 3 times before she read anything else. She needed to read it 3 times before her body believed it, before the thing that had been locked tight in her chest for 3 weeks released itself all at once in a way she had not anticipated and could not immediately control. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She sat very still. Outside, somewhere in the street below, a cart went past, and someone called out to someone else, and the world continued its complete indifference to the fact that she had just been handed back something she had been quietly preparing to lose. She read the rest of the letter. He was alive, and the campaign had reached a critical turning point, and he would be returning within the month. Not permanently. The war was not over, would not be over for some time yet, but a return. A temporary one. Long enough to resupply, to consult with the parliamentary committee, to attend the meetings that could not be conducted by correspondence. Long enough to come home. She sat with that for a long time. The fire burned. The afternoon light moved across the floor in the slow way it did in winter, thin and unhurried. She thought about what it would mean to have him in this house again after 14 months. To hear his voice in the rooms instead of imagining it, to sit across a table from him at breakfast and not have to read the weight of paper to know how he was. Then she did something she had been composing in her head for months. She took out a clean sheet of paper, she dipped her pen, and she wrote him the honest letter. The one she had never written because she had never been able to afford to write it, because the letters she sent him had always had to serve a purpose, and honesty, in wartime, was a luxury she had not been able to justify. She wrote about the fear, the specific, particular quality of the fear, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announced itself and demanded attention, but the quiet, domestic kind that lived in the spaces between tasks.
The fear that arrived at 4 in the morning and sat at the foot of the bed. The fear that made her read his letters 3 times, not because she needed the information, but because she needed his voice, even his written voice, even the voice that carefully omitted the things that would worry her. She wrote about Collie, all of it, everything she had done, every conversation, every letter to Hexam, the meeting with Graves, the way she had pulled the thread without letting him feel it until it was too late. She wrote it plainly and without apology because she was not sorry she had done it. She would do it again, she would do it faster, but she wanted him to know. She had been carrying it alone for weeks, and she was tired of carrying things alone, and this was the one letter where she did not have to think about who might read it, because she was going to burn it. She wrote about the loneliness, not the loneliness of missing him, though that was real enough. The specific loneliness of being competent, of managing everything so thoroughly that no one around her ever thought to ask if she was managing. Of being the person who held things together so well that the holding together became invisible. And the invisible work was the only kind that never got acknowledged, because the whole point of it was that it left no mark. She wrote for an hour, 4 pages, the longest letter she had ever written. Then she read it back. She read it slowly, all 4 pages, and she felt, as she read, the strange dual sensation of being both the woman who had written it and the woman who was reading it for the first time. Feeling the weight of everything the first woman had been carrying, and the quiet shock of seeing it all laid out in one place, in her own handwriting, taking up 4 pages of her best paper. She sat with it for a moment. Then she folded it once. She held it over the candle flame. She watched it catch and burn, the paper curling and blackening, the ink disappearing line by line until there was nothing left but a small pile of ash in the fireplace grate. She picked up a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote, "My dear Cornelius, I am very glad you are coming home. Everything here is well. I will tell you the rest when I see you." She sealed it. She set it with the Morning Post. She looked at the ash in the grate for a long moment. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to tell the housekeeper to prepare the Duke's rooms. He was coming home. She had kept everything standing until he could. That was her war. That was all of it. And it was finished now, or nearly, and no dispatch would ever record it, and no historian would ever name it, and she found, sitting in that quiet room in the last of the winter light, that she had made her peace with that. Almost. This is Prince Pedro's love bait. Harriet Ashworth never made it into the history books, but she held an empire together with both hands while the world watched her husband and called him great. If her story sat with you, if you felt the weight of what she carried, subscribe, because next time we go into another room history kept locked, and the woman inside it, she is even more extraordinary than Harriet. You do not want to miss her.